In the name of God, Creator, pain bearer, and Spirit of life. During last month's federal election in Australia, one couldn't help noticing many large yellow billboards around the place proclaiming freedom, freedom, freedom. I had to ask myself, freedom from what? I thought perhaps this might refer to the restrictions imposed on our population because of the COVID pandemic, and that was the only possible explanation I could come up with. Other than those restrictions, which have proven to be temporary, of course, I couldn't think of any other reason for a political party to offer freedom. Why? We Australians are the most free people on earth. We freely elect our own governments. We are free to come and go exactly as we wish. And provided we don't break the criminal laws, we're free to do exactly as we wish with our lives. Did you notice that when we read from Paul's letter to the churches at Galatia, when we read that this morning, he speaks of the nature of Christian freedom and is exhorting the people to use their Christian freedom in a positive manner. Whilst they have the freedom to do as they choose, they're free to use it for self-indulgence, selfishness. Paul is asking them to exercise constraint and through love, and I quote from what he said, become slaves to each other. Become slaves to each other. Whoa, that's an extreme statement. This is freedom of a very different ilk from the sort we see here in this morning's excerpt from Luke's Gospel. More of that in a minute. We need to ask the question, I think, firstly, who are these Samaritans? We read so much about these Samaritans in the New Testament. They originate from the same people as the Judean Jews of the southern kingdom, Judah. Samaritans are from the northern kingdom, Israel. And they claim they are the true Israelites, the descendants of the northern Israelite tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, if you look back into the Old Testament, who survived the destruction of the kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. They were not caught up in the disastrous exile in Babylon. Now, the Samaritans described their religion as the holy faith that began with Moses, unchanged over the millennia that since passed. Samaritans believe the Jewish Torah and Judaism by extension have been corrupted by time and no longer serve the duties that God mandated to the Israelites way back to Moses on Mount Sinai. Why did the Jews not like the Samaritans and vice versa? Well, for hundreds of years, the Jews and the people of Samaria had been enemies. Do you know, they did not agree about where God's people should worship. That's what the bottom line was. Jews worshipped only in the temple in Jerusalem, while Samaritans worshipped only on Mount Gerizim. So you can see that people were divided and arguing amongst themselves about religion well before the time of Jesus. So the situation was certainly not new when the early church was in formation. And frankly, I don't have to say this, everyone knows it, nothing has changed right up until today, 2022. Our own Anglican Church is a prime example. In this gospel story, they, that is, the Samaritan people in the village, did not receive Jesus and his followers. Why? Why? What do you reckon? Because, quote, his face was set towards Jerusalem, unquote. That's what we read. That's why they refused hospitality, because his face, Jesus' face, was set. In other words, he was determined. He was not going either to one side or another. He was determined going to Jerusalem. Now, while brief, this explanation is telling, very telling, especially given the deep division between Samaritans and Jews over worship sites. Tensions over this distinction would have been even more pronounced after the Jewish destruction of the Samaritan temple, the sanctuary, on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim was destroyed in 128 BCE by John Hyrcanus, high priest and prince of the Jews, on the refusal of the Samaritans to be converted to Judaism. He destroyed the temple of the Samaritans on Mount Gerizim. That's where they believed that is where God wanted them to worship. So this act obviously exacerbated the acrimony between Samaritans and Jews, as you can well imagine. The rejection of Jesus by this particular Samaritan village focuses on their negative response to Jesus' Jerusalem destination. Yet, this negative response seems to be not anticipated, because Jesus has sent messengers into the village to prepare for his arrival. He didn't expect to be refused. And the response of these Samaritan villagers goes against the implicit expectation for hospitality, and so would seem to be a non-representative response for Samaritans to Jewish travellers. In his later writing of Acts, Luke will highlight that Samaritans do receive the good news of the Messiah. Now, this is a direct reversal of this initial Samaritan scene in this gospel, and is a sign of the later restoration of all of Israel, including Samaritans. The reaction of the disciples, James and John, would seem to be a bit over the top. They're deeply offended by the villagers' rejection. Jesus is not. He continues on his journey without even a word against those who do not receive him. Now, this morning we read from 1 Kings chapter 2, where Isaiah is taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. But if we go back to 2 Kings chapter 1, just one chapter before, we read of Elijah calling down fire upon King Ahaziah's troops. Now, it's a great story and well worth a read. So I suggest a bit of homework. So you ex-teachers, if you go home and have a look at 2 Kings chapter 1, you'll read the story. There's a clause that is often missed out in our translations of the gospel, this story in the gospel. Verse 54 reads, "When his disciples James and John saw this, they said, 'Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them as Elijah did?'" As Elijah did. Right. So you can see that Luke has taken this image and threat of destruction directly from the prophet Isaiah. In contrast to James and John, Jesus shows no desire for judgment to come upon these Samaritans. Instead, he rebukes the two disciples for their perspective. Luke has already highlighted the divine mercy that surrounds the arrival of Jesus. Jesus' mission focuses on proclaiming the good news and the year of the Lord's favour, as is written there, with Luke leaving off the final reference from Isaiah chapter 61. If you look at the end of Isaiah chapter 61, and then that proclaims the day of vengeance of our God. Vengeance. The present image of Jesus' ministry in Luke is all about restoration, not vengeance. So it is not surprising that Jesus rejects this idea of enacting judgment. Instead, the group moves on to another village, and that's potentially, of course, another Samaritan village. Do you know why they're in Samaria? Samaria was on the road, the most direct route from Galilee to Jerusalem. That's why they, without having to go a long way around, they had the direct route and it went through Samaria. So that's why. Now there are a few lessons we can draw from this story. First, as has been said before, Jesus, or the Spirit of God, if you like to put it that way, will not force himself upon anyone. I think that's a big lesson of this. We all have the freedom to reject or accept the Spirit of God into our lives. If we should choose to reject, the story tells us there is no condemnation from the Spirit. There's disappointment, there's sadness maybe, but not condemnation. That's what I get out of this story. It's very clear. Maybe, as the story of the Samaritans, there may be another opportunity. What happened to them as we read on in the history and the story of what happened in the past, in the future years. Secondly, it still amazes me that many Christians of our own time still want to quote passages depicting judgment and retribution upon those whom they judge to have broken God's laws. Well, all they need to do is to read this story to learn that Jesus showed the world an entirely different experience of God than those of the old Hebrew Bible, that is the Old Testament. The disciples judge the village people. Jesus does not. The disciples want retribution for the offence of rejection. They are angered, embarrassed. Jesus is not, and simply moves on. Of course, the Samaritan people remained ignorant of the blessings that could have been theirs should they have welcomed Jesus into their town. And people today who reject Jesus and the Spirit of God also may live out their lives in ignorance of the beauty that comes to them with that Spirit. Paul summed it up. We read this morning from Paul's letter to the Galatians. In verse 22 of Galatians chapter 5, Paul says, by contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's a matter of choice. And we all have the absolute freedom to choose. May the Lord be with you. Amen.